we wanted to give a practitioner's perspective on working with Sufi narratives in the field of art. That would be sorely lacking if we didn't speak in the language that we're generally speaking in, which is the language of art. So I'm going to turn it over to Eleanor, and she's going to present a very famous story by Jalaluddin Rumi, which will help to frame what we will talk about later in terms of processes.
I'm sure this is a story that you all know very well. It's a very beautiful story, Jalaluddin Rumi. And it begins far away in a land of mist and mountains. There was a queen who lived in a beautiful palace. In the morning, the white marble palace walls and the snow-capped peaks glowed golden in the morning light. And in the evening, they blushed pink with the setting sun. And at night, the lake in the gardens shimmered under stars and moonlight. Now, the Queen enjoyed nothing more than holding tea parties, inviting people to come from all over the world so that she could learn about new cultures, new languages, and see herself reflected in all the world around her. Sometimes she would host in the gardens and they would take tea in the pavilion, which was also built from the white marble. And it had a crystal glass ceiling, so there was always plenty of light. Well, one day, the Queen was sitting in her pavilion when she said, "There's something missing. A mural, a work of art, that's what we need. Something for everyone to enjoy." And no sooner had she had this thought when she sent emissaries to go across the world to go in search of the greatest artist that they could find. So the emissaries set off across the world. They visited thousands of art galleries, hundreds of cities. They met with many impoverished artists. And eventually they returned with 2 artists. One was Greek, the other Chinese. They couldn't decide between them who was the greatest artist. That decision would have to be made by Her Majesty. And the Queen said, "A contest, a competition, that's what we need." And it was decided that each artist would have 40 days to work on either side of the pavilion. They would have whatever they needed. Anything that they asked for would be given for them. But as they worked, a curtain would be drawn between them so that neither would see each other's work. In fact, no one would see the work. It would be a complete secret until the 40 days were over. So the curtain was drawn and the artists began. The Chinese artists began to order paints in every colour, Indian yellow, Prussian blue, purple lake, magenta for Indian, emerald green, rose and gold. Servants ran to and from the pavilion. They brought in enormous canvas and palettes and cloths and brushes of every size. The Chinese artists worked day and night, hardly stopping to eat and drink. Everyone was convinced a masterpiece was in the making. Meanwhile, the Greek artist sat in thought. And then more thought. He could hear the Chinese artist on the other side of the room working away, but he just sat there on his stool, staring at the wall and wondering what to do. And then he got to his feet and started pacing up and down the room, still thinking and pondering and now fretting and worrying. What was he going to do? Time was ticking, the days were passing by, and he had no idea what he was going to paint. His days and nights were filled with fear, doubt, and jealousy. That Chinese artist! Dark thoughts clouded his heart and peace of mind. One night, he was sitting on his stool, just staring at the wall, when he saw the moon in full, coming out from behind a cloud, filling the room with silvery light. And he watched until the sun rose, filling the room with golden light. And he watched. For the rest of that day, he watched the changing light, the shifting shadows. And then, that night, he picked up the tools of an artist and began. In the days that followed, the Chinese artist began to hear strange sounds coming from the other side of the room. It started very low at first, this very low, coarse sound. But as the days went on, the sound became higher and finer, like this. Shh, 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 until he began to sing the song of a violin. And it sang higher and higher. It rose into the mountains, higher and higher. It echoed among the stars, higher and higher, and then silence. 40 days were over. The Queen and all her courtiers came to see the work of art. First, they would see the work of the Chinese artist. A curtain had been drawn across the canvas. Everyone waited in great anticipation. Then the servants pulled aside the curtain and everybody gasped. There was a rapturous applause. It was magnificent. The detail, the colour, the craftsmanship. It was a painting of the palace surrounded by the gardens and all the mountains. And it was a masterpiece. Everyone congratulated the Chinese artist, everyone, including the Greek artist, congratulated him with sincere warmth and praise. Now it was time to see the work of the Greek artist, so everyone turned just as light fell through the window. The servants pulled the curtain aside with a great swish and silence. Nobody could speak. The beauty that they now beheld had snatched away their reason. The Greek artist had painted nothing. In fact, there was not a single mark on the wall. The Greek artist had scoured and scrubbed and polished that wall until it shone. And as it did, it reflected the work of the Chinese artist. The painting reappeared in all its color and detail, but here, in light, it was lovelier, far, far lovelier. Far away within you, there is a palace among the mountains, and a pavilion in a garden. And above the door to that pavilion it is written, "Those who polish their hearts are free. Every moment, instantly, they behold beauty."
Thank you, Eleanor. So that is
Not sure how much they heard of that, the sound was cutting out. I'm sorry. In the usual Zoom, I don't know what you got from that.
We were stunned, that we all.
So that is one of our popular one of our most popular Sufi narratives that we've adapted, and it's actually one which we love performing in the month of Ramadan because it has an underlying metaphysical theme which correlates well with Ramadan and fasting. Um, so you would have seen, those of you who are familiar with the story, you would have seen or you would have noticed certain choices were made in the telling of the story. Um, and so we thought we would reflect a little bit on the nature of those choices and Eleanor, given that she was the one who wrote and adapted. Um, so first of all, uh, you chose in the original version of Rumi, he speaks about a king, but you chose to use a queen instead. Perhaps you want to
Yeah, so
talk a
I
little
felt
bit.
that there was the feminine principles that for me that I felt was so powerful in the story that I felt would be further highlighted, illuminated by placing a character of 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 a queen in that role of the king. I mean, the king generally in the story seems, I think, takes more of a back seat. It's about the artist, but I by making it a queen, I wanted to sort of to say illuminate the story, the resonance of the story of this reflection of that she was looking for in the world around her, with and that with her palace as well. But that brings us to another point as well, the scenery of the scenery of the story. Um, so in the way that in the setting of this rather elevated in the mountains, I was seeing the snow-capped peaks reflecting light. And so again, I wanted that as a further illumination of the beautiful wisdom and illustration that Rumi was trying to highlight and bring to the fore in this story. Um, so this world, this mountainscape sort of came to me, and I saw that also reflected in the palace, and then and so on. Uh, so
Yeah,
yeah,
I think for me, as we were working on in the story, I felt these choices were very uh, contextual as well, insofar as Islam, in the sense of seen very often through quite a masculine lens, and that the beauty or the feminine principle, or as Ibn Arabi talks about, the maternal prophetic principle, is so obscured that people don't really get a good appreciation of it. So I felt that this choice was also contextually quite appropriate in terms of conveying and amplifying the beautiful names, the Jamali aspects of the Sufi quest. So yeah, so those were a few of the things. I think and then there was some commentary and very subtle commentary, as you can do in theater, because you're shrinking the world down to the micro, and therefore amplify anything that appears is amplified. The role of intuition, I think, we also commenting on the role of intuition. Um, and the struggle of the Sufi to become a clear channel for ilham, for inspiration, creative, generative ilham. And there was something on the issue, in the West, especially where Muslims are concerned, the debate around secular versus the sacred. So when Eleanor says the tools of an artist, and holds her hands in the position of dua, we were amplifying the essential nature of of verticality, sacred verticality of imagination in the role of Sufi artists from the beginning and as custodians of art and of aesthetics, and so forth. I think we were talking earlier about, you were looking into marble, and obviously you talked about how
yeah,
you wanted to reflect in the end, in the beginning of the story, what was in the end to create that sort of sacred circle. So that theme of reflection runs through. But can you maybe
Yeah, the theme reflection also then, as I was reading up about the polishing of marble, and I thought it was a rather beautiful metaphor how the in the process of polishing marble that it begins with a very sort of rough, the sound is itself is very rough and coarse and low, and as you go on, as you polishing it finer and finer, it actually creates this sound which is becomes this finer sound, and so that for me was a beautiful metaphor for reflecting his the polishing of his heart, and the finesse that he attained, and purifying himself. So
and then I think the final point we
mm,
were talking about before as we were preparing is the way in which you then sort of indicate that there is a higher music. There's a music of the
mm,
ruh, the soul, the song of the spirit, as Rumi talks about the song of the reed crying out because of separation, which
mm,
the famous metaphor of the with which the Matnavi begins. And so how the sound, there's a sort of transcendence, musicality, if you like,
mm,
maybe
yeah.
talking, maybe going on to the music of the spheres and all that type of thing. But so that was another beautiful aspect in the story. So yeah, so a 9-10 minute story, which usually when obviously you're seeing it through the medium of Zoom, and we've had through the pandemic we had to work virtually all the 2 years, so that gave us confidence to join you. Otherwise, we'd have been a little bit reticent. But in a live performance, obviously, when you're in a room, there's going to be a slightly different experience. I hope you can appreciate. We know everyone's quite your end of a long day, so we want to keep to time. I think I'm going to just go through. The intensive processes that we are working with, we're developing. I would call our work, the work we're doing with Sufi narratives, very much a laboratory, because most of these narratives were not written for the stage, and a lot of them are quite anecdotal, quite succinct. So we have to go through a number of stages, creative stages. Of course, first is translation. uh, so much of these stories were translated a long time ago, although have been increasing some more newer translations. So we have to look at the translation. So I use my knowledge of Arabic and Farsi and Urdu to, when we're working with text from those languages, to where possible, make sure that we are happy with the translations, and sometimes we have to do some reworking of translations to make sure that the intention of the author, as we understand it, of course, with our limited understanding, really comes through. And then there's a symbological interpretation. So, what are the symbols and metaphors being used? uh, the sacred the sacred symbolisms, and some of these stories have very sophisticated symbological architecture, and so you then have to work through what these symbols are, and how is a contemporary audience who are less literate in these symbologies and these sacred symbols, how can they be made more accessible to them? And obviously in theater, using set, prop, costume, we've tried to find ways of unpacking that symbology for people to make it more accessible, if not in words or in script, in a text, but in the actual design. Um, so we use a lot of Islamic design elements. Then the other layer is cultural and historical context. So a lot of these stories, and narratives which are quite anecdotal, in order for them to have real dramatic body, we have to go back to the culture and history from which the narratives have come from, and enrich the quite anecdotal story with wider context, cultural and historical context, which gives us an opportunity often to share the wider Sufi worldview and a wider Sufi context of these Sufis, of Attar and Rumi, the times that we're living in, what was going on in those times. So that gives us some very rich theatrical settings within which to, or lenses through which to explore the stories. Um, and then there are subtextual layers and references. So most of the time when Rumi and Attar and many others are writing, they always had assumptions from their, they had always had assumptions from their readers that their readers would be somehow somewhat versed in in some or in some cases all the Islamic sciences. So we know we're working with audiences who for whom those assumptions are not fair because they don't have that background. So then we have to decide what are the most important subtextual layers and references that an audience needs to grasp in order for this narrative to really to have impact and traction. So whether sometimes they're verses of the Quran, sometimes they come from the Hadith literature, sometimes they come from the teachings of other Sufis, earlier Sufis. So we try to enrich the script with that. And then of course there's a dramaturgy, the dramaturgy on stage, how you're directing the piece and so forth. And then there's and this is the probably most critical part is the transmission. Having storytellers or having artists who are have devoted themselves to Sufi practices, so that they can be transmitters, conductors of energy, really, of the story, so that we leave, so that we leave just the confines of time and space, and we offer communication at another frequency, really frequency of the heart, and that's what audience mostly respond to. They talk about having had their hearts touched by these stories because the artists have used their whole selves as instruments or as channels for these stories to flow. And then, of course, we have to consider the contemporary cultural idiom in the context of our audiences that they're living in, which leads us often to include contemporary references. Even if just one word, you can use one word which has a contemporary resonance today, which will give an audience a buy-in to a story which otherwise they might have found difficulty doing. And then we have to look at who is our audience specifically, because sometimes we work a lot with in schools with children, so we have to consider the age, consider the cultural heritage backgrounds, and so forth, in order to use the right vernaculars to reach. We just came from a school where we were telling a Sufi tale from the Punjab, and we Eleanor was it's it was for boys, so she was using some references to even Tom Cruise's Mission Impossible to help get it across. Anyway, I can see we run over at time. Thank you so much. I hope we've given them some insight to what we do and how we work and the processes that we're developing for your audience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. Thank you, Lukman. This was amazing. Really, really nice. Thank you. And we heard you perfectly. Don't you worry. It really, was absolutely gorgeous. Thank you. Yeah, are there any comments, questions? Isabella.
Yeah, first of all, I wanted to thank you, Eleanor, for this wonderful performance. I couldn't breathe. It was so wonderful. And I remarked that seeing you on the screen, and it's a very large screen which we have, it created also a kind of a, let's say, so we could perceive you very well. So I was wondering, do you have noticed or which, maybe sorry, I'm a little bit confused. I will start again. So my question is, since you're a performer, and how do you adapt to acting in front of a camera of something which will be screened? That would be very interesting for me to hear. Thank you.
Yeah, I suppose it's about maybe it's about a circle of transmission. I think most performers just naturally begin to adapt. If I have to transmit to an audience further, it's about an energy, or maybe it's not quite in the way Patsy Rosenberg talks about the three circles, but because I don't like to be inflammatory, I always try to maintain as she talks about the second circle of intimacy in performance, even when I'm if I'm performing to a big theatre or in a film. But yeah, I think it's more about the fact that you can't, you've got the best thing taken away from you when you're trying to perform on film, is that you're not breathing the same air as the audience. And so the heart transmission it's more difficult because there's so much more to storytelling than just the words. The communication, there's so much more in the communication between the communication of a story, which is not about the words, it's the energy and what you receive from the audience. So that's the most difficult. That's the greatest challenge, really, is about not having that real contact.
But you succeeded very well, so
Yeah.
compliments.
Yes, Khayaal and Christian Sur.
Yes, thank you so much for this beautiful story. This was lovely. And I'm particularly interested in the questions in terms of the choices that you made during your narration. Of course, you have the plot, you have the theme. I think there's lots of things that are kind of prepared. You have the structures. And I think we heard about these. And there, of course, there were already structural kind of decisions in place. But what are the decisions that you're making literally on the spot? Meaning, I don't know, I would like to get a sense how far, I don't really think so, but how far the performance is scripted or rehearsed. How many times did you perform this that way? And what are the choices that you're making? Maybe the overall question is, how far can you, let's say in terms of translation, in terms of changing of characters, how far can you change the story without changing the plots? And yeah, I would like to hear some details that you would like to share as a storyteller.
Well, I mean, in the way that this is the way for me. This is the way that the story speaks for me, and that I mean, I could, as an exercise, I could tell the story in a completely different way. The characters could be very different, and there are, as I'm sure you're well aware, you will read different translations of this story. You will hear different storytellers, and it will be in a very different setting, and there will be different parts of the story that are highlighted for you. But the way that it came out is so. I mean, I could do it as an exercise, but I probably wouldn't, because this is the way it speaks for me. So as a whole, I don't know that as an exercise I wouldn't try to tell the story unless there was a context where I wanted to reach a particular audience. Say this was just the right story, but there was an audience who I needed to reach contextually, and the setting maybe would just be completely wrong. These mountains just wouldn't speak for them. And then maybe I think, okay, is there another way that is true to me, but the way that I can really stay true to this story and connect with it? Then yes, of course. Because I'm well aware that, of course, some maybe, I don't know, the mountainscape or that wouldn't resonate so well with, maybe if I told this story to people who maybe, I know, far-flung part of the earth, who lived maybe in a very stayed in a very insular part of the world where they'd never actually experienced mountains, then of course, but I wanted to convey the beauty of the story, I would have to sell it in a very different setting, in a different setting.
No, you also asked about what are you working from a script and how many times have you performed?
So what I'll do is usually when I'm working on a story, I'll read different translations, get a sense of the story, and then let it sort of live with me for a while, and then I begin to dream it and see it, and then I will write it down. But then when I start speaking it, it changes. It always changes because it's that's the written word. So then I really discovered the story when I just start speaking it, and then it's just about knowing the story, and then the words are there, but they're just to help. It's really I find that I'll be more articulate and flow better with the story when I'm connected, when I'm in the moment, when I'm with the story in the moment and just living it. And that's where I need to be when I'm telling the story. It's not about how am I going to remember these lines. It's I've got to be in the moment of the story, living it. And then if I've done the groundwork, then the language is there. So I'm not always sticking to an absolute script. No.
Mm. No, this is the perfect answer that I was kind of hoping for almost, that you need to be in the story. And I think it was so beautiful how you, let's say, showed the landscape by imitating of how it looks like here. And let's say you were really in the moment, and it was so beautiful. I think all of you, literally, you have to be in this kind of, well, Schiffelin is calling this deep participation. You need to be in it. And let's say you are talking about your environment. And that I found so impressive. So all your facial expressions, your gestures, your movements, your positioning was, right in the moment. And I think that's what a storyteller who's just telling a story or telling a script does not reach an audience. And I think it was beautiful, also kind of in light of Isabel's kind of question in terms of how do you feel about let's say, talking to a camera, literally. Yeah. Where you don't see the facial expressions of let's say how people respond directly, which is always difficult, but yet you need to be in this moment.
Yeah.
And I think that's where how the dynamic can be unpacked and how you can feel, or how we can feel what you feel or what you like to kind of get across. But it's so interesting what decisions are made by a storyteller in the moment. And of course that's I would imagine part of the situation in which you then interact with your audience or connect with the audience.
Exactly. It's I'm telling the story when I'm doing it on screen, as I was just now. As you're right, all I've got is just me and telling the story and living with it in that moment. But you just have that. But I don't know how you're receiving it. I can't feel it until afterwards when whereas of course in the theatre I can do that. I can find out how you're receiving it as well as how I'm living it too, and then it's far more beautiful because it becomes a conversation then, and then you can guide the story to where your audience want to be, when they want to be in the garden or that moment in that place a bit longer, and you can let them be there, and when they're getting a bit restless, then you can move them along, and you can't do that on screen.
Yes. Yeah. So you would, just what you said, if you were, sorry, if I may take a moment, but if what you just said, it is almost like you are carrying the audience with you, but the audience is also carrying you with them.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so that becomes this immersive moment. And I loved your metaphor that you have to breathe the same air, the inside and outside, the vibration, the resonance, sharing the same space and being there is of course something different. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Is that beautiful? That quote was the Ursula Le Guin quote. Do you remember that one?
Yeah, there's a beautiful Ursula Le Guin quote about the people together enjoy
the moment of community.
The moment of community in a story. And you articulated very well about the performer carrying the audience and the audience vice versa. And there's a sort of nexus that happens. And what's very interesting, one of the things that the dilemmas that we have is that because I'm always producing and everything and stage managing and so forth, I can see marked differences in performances where Eleanor can see the audience versus when she can't see the audience. There's a very different energy field. And then so because a lot of time in British theatre, probably as well than German theatre, the performances, because of the lights on the stage, the performer cannot see the audience. Whereas a lot of time we're working outside of conventional theatre spaces in schools and so forth, where Eleanor has clear sight lines both ways. And so there's very interesting dynamics around
That's
that.
true. But you also, of course, be on site, you get a feeling when you're just, as you say, in the same room. You can,
Yeah.
you know, I think we get that even if we're giving talks, don't we? Or whenever we're in touch with audience, this intuition that we have with an audience that we can feel where they are as well. You know.
Thank you. Christian had a...
Okay, yeah, so thanks so much. It's absolutely fantastic to hear about your work and your thoughts around your work and to be presented with this story in this way. And I can only hope to be able to see it in person. It's even better. So I was really caught by how, when you describe now how you needed to be in the story, and I really, when you were telling the story, I really also felt something like that. At least I understood when you described it like that. You were really very much present in that story and created that for us. And then something happened just at the end, where the energy sort of shifts, and there's a direct address to us, I guess. Like really also with your gaze in a very like direct way, and I felt that was very strong. That shift, just that shift was really very powerful. Just sort of having been part of a story, but sort of as an audience, and then suddenly it's sort of and in our hearts and stuff. And then I was thinking about what you said now about how you seek to really actually channel these stories through the heart, if I understood correctly, or as if speaking from the heart or something. But I wonder if you could just slow down for us a little bit and maybe say something about what do you actually do, or how is that you make those shifts of energy or channeling from the heart, if that's what you're doing. Like what actually goes on apart from the words that we heard and stuff, because it definitely works on us.
I think it's about a preparedness to be vulnerable, and to just that, to say this is my heart. I'm going to let you experience what is touching me very deeply in this story, or what is the character where this is, I'm sure you've heard many of performers saying acting, it's not about wearing a mask, it's actually about bearing your soul. And that is somehow, for some reason, I've found within the frame, I suppose it's within the frame of storytelling, whenever I know I'm a vehicle for a story, that I can be vulnerable. But I have found also that maybe what's important to mention is that, because before I came into Sufism, I found this and before, when I was just I didn't have any particularly spiritual path, or and it was therefore that it was more about the art for the art's sake. It was more about my place in the art in the world. It's not the same. Once I started following a path, and my work is for that, is for the mission, for the beauty that I want to share of these beautiful stories. That when I have a mission to do that, and I just want to be the vehicle for that, that I find there's a strength that I can do that with. I say with ease, but there's a lot of work that goes into it. But what I mean is that I have the courage to do that. Maybe is because it's not about me at all. I want to be a vehicle so that other people can also experience the beauty in those, really live it themselves. The audience can live it themselves. So I'm doing it out of love, but that's giving me that courage to be vulnerable. I hope that answers that for you.
Yeah, and I think there's something around this gesture that you do. I don't know if that's also describing that shift, because if there's vulnerability, maybe that's present in the whole story, but there's a shift towards that end where this gesture that you do, that was how I felt it. Like,
Yeah, when I talk about it's almost like vulnerability and confidence. I know I'm assured when I go on stage, it's because and I can do that and I can make those shifts. It's because I make those shifts because I'm living in the moment of trying to live in the moment of the story. That's why um, I can live solely in the moment of that character and then become the narrator and talk directly to you. It's because it's living, because you're living in that moment, just I suppose in the way children do. They're in tears one moment, having a panic the next moment they're um, uh, so that's what
Yeah,
the presence.
I think, I mean, Sufism is predicated on heart-to-heart transmission, and so I think, and I can, being the closest witness to Eleanor's growth as a storyteller, there is an energy to these stories, and there's an alchemy to these stories, and that when a person devotes themselves to these stories, it changes them. So the art that they're practicing is not just about the story; they are they are the art themselves. And I think this has always been true in Sufism. Whatever art, whether it's calligraphy or whether it's whatever art the Sufis would practice, they would consider their craft to be themselves to be an object of the craft as much as the canvas or the wood or the. So I think what's happened with Eleanor over these years is that the alchemy of these stories has had a profound effect on her imagination and her ability to transmit and to, as she says, be vulnerable. Um, and I see it whenever we go out. So yeah, yeah.
But then for this story particularly does resonate with me because I do find myself when I was on the journey of working with a story, some of them I have to, I know there's something in there and I can't get to it and I grapple with it and I go through some days of torture trying to find my way in or find where so yeah, I can understand. I really resonate with that character.
Are there any more comments?
I would have one, and maybe in resonance to what Christian was saying. I think the idea of the timing again is quite interesting, or the playing of the role that you transform into the narrator. What I like, and maybe I don't know if you have been at the previous sessions, but I like very much the idea of vulnerability, the fragility in which you kind of navigate that particular situation. And of course, that's your heart, as you said. We had, and I think that's a completely different extreme, as we had, let's say, the self-flagellation or the pain inflicted on the body, where we have the similar phenomenon, if I would say so. Although you have physical pain, the body becomes somewhat of a different, let's say, vehicle, or it's a different state of mind. And it's not prepared, let's say, what I'm thinking here, or try to think aloud, but the way in which these different perceptions of oneself, one's body, one's soul, or the intimacy, what is inside and what is outside, or what is, let's say, from the outside, let's say the knife that is cutting inside, and the different forms of, let's say, pain, or not to say suffering, but joy, and these, well, intense emotions, I would say. And of course, the risk taking on stage, or even then possibly most of us know who are teaching, standing in front of the class, and if something doesn't go wrong, or some doesn't go right, something goes wrong with the technology, then you have to improvise. And sometimes these are the best classes, at least students tell me, that, let's say, where it's not prepared, where it's not scripted, but where the own vulnerability comes across, or let's say someone is kind of crossing the boundaries of what is the, let's say, what is the self and what is the other, what's the inside and what's the outside. So it's just, let's say, just some feedback or some ideas that I found very interesting, particularly in the context of this today's session, when we talk about pain and the, let's say, Fana, or the death of the self. And it's literally also a death of the self on the stage, because you become somebody else, and at least adapt sensorially to that different setting. And I think the best storytellers make you cry or laugh. And I think if the storyteller or the clown could be a different setting too, but where this something is going over, and that's very, very different in that context. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much for your sharing those. There was that feedback.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it gives me a lot to think about. Yeah, transforming on stage and dying to yourself. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah, indeed. There's absolutely there's really no place for the ego on stage. Really, there's no place for it. I don't think we even got time to go into it. We just find so often so many resonances, don't we, with the metaphorical or different analogies we find with theatre, and the spiritual path of Sufism. All the teachings of that an actor has to undergo are really so analogous with, as we call it, it's the divine theatre. Just as you're saying, we have to be present. We have to be free of our be free of it, or tame our egos, have control, the discipline, the freedom that only comes about through the discipline. It's when we really know our work, when we really know, as you are when you're teaching, it's when you really know it. Then there's moments of sort of liberation when you're on your feet, you're improvising, you're being spontaneous. It's when creativity.
The interesting thing is, if we may just continue, if, let's say, with the fictionality, you're telling stories, you're telling fictions, and as you brought up the theater, I think it was 2006 or so, or 5. I attended a conference in Copenhagen where a Shakespeare player was, as you said, with the rehearsal too, he was asked to how to put it, how he would play Shakespeare. And he was just sitting there, and we in the audience were getting nervous. And he said, that's it. He just tricked us in pretending to prepare or to think, like, say, it's the same gesture almost, let's say, of the artist, the Greek artist that you had in your story. He's thinking there, and you were thinking, well, what's going on? And he then just turned to the audience and said, that was it. And we were all caught by our own, let's say, deception, that we thought, well, he's thinking on how to prepare to perform Shakespeare, and he has to take a moment, and maybe he takes one more, but that's where we slipped into the other layer. And I think that's exactly also what you are doing. So
great, thank you. That's a very good illustration. I like that. I like that. That's a good story.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Is there are there any further things to share? Well, thank you, Eleanor. Thank you, Lupan. Thank you, Jens. That was and it was so precious to be able to see you, and yeah, you touched our hearts. Thank you so very much for joining us here this evening and for giving us this gift.
Yeah, thank you, because you're all up
Yeah.
so much later than we are. So really, thank you so much for your time and
1 hour. Thank you. Many thanks. Thanks.